Good evening. Welcome. Hope everyone's settled with a glass of wine or a cup of tea, wherever you're connecting to us from. Thank you all so much for joining us for this evening's discussion of Parwana, recipes and stories from an Afghan kitchen with Durkhanai Ayubi in conversation with Chrissy Neen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. As we celebrate NAIDOC Week this week, I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty of the land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand over to our speakers for this evening, I'd first like to reiterate some of the information that was mentioned in the email you were sent earlier. You've automatically been placed on mute and will remain so throughout the event, but I will unmute you at the end so you can join me in thanking our speakers. Durkhanai is keen to answer your questions towards the end of the event if there's time, so please start sending them through to me. You can send them through to me in the chat box. That's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and I'll read them out as soon as I'm prompted to do so along with your name. I'd also like to mention that any books that you purchase this evening on the Avid Reader website, you will receive 10% off. Durkhanai's book is actually specially discounted with us at the moment, down to from 45 to 40, so you'll get it at that price. I will send you through the link, and if you type in the code EVENT, you'll also get 10% off any other purchases, as this is already discounted, not off this. So I'd now like to introduce Chrissy Neen, our in conversation partner. Chrissy Neen is the actual events manager of Avid Reader, and she's the award-winning author of memoirs, fiction, and poetry. She has written and directed broadcast documentaries for SBS and ABC television, and she is the current Copyright Agency Limited Fellow for Nonfiction. Thank you so much, Chrissy. I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Jen. It's an absolute delight to be here to discuss this book, Parwana. There's a beautiful picture of the cover. It is the most gorgeous book that we have in the shop at the moment, bar none, I would say. This is actually taking the cake for the most beautiful book on the shelves right now. And Parwana is by Durkhanai Ayubi, and Durkhanai is involved with the day-to-day responsibilities of her family-run eating place in Adelaide, Parwana, and Kuchi Deli Parwana. She also writes freelance opinion editorial pieces for a range of newspapers and websites, and is undertaking a fellowship for social equity funded by the Atlantic Institute in New York, which must be an interesting thing to do in the middle of a pandemic. Is that true, Durkhanai?
Well, it's all kind of shifted into a virtual space, but yeah, super interesting because I still kind of get to stay very connected to other fellows across the globe and hear about, you know, the pandemic as it's unfolded globally, like hearing how people are experiencing it in South Africa, China, America, you know, so it's actually been a great time to be part of that global community. Also, I should have said this first. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased to be here.
It is an absolute delight. And I did hold up the cover of this incredible book before, but I've also, just to start us off and to give us a little taste of what is in store, I've marked a couple of pages to show you how gorgeous this book actually is. So I'm just going to show you a few pages to our audience tonight, because, like, honestly, the colors, the textures, it is such a beautiful piece of work. There's one there. I'll see if I can. That's an incredible spread of a table there. This book is a delight for the senses. It's a delight for the eyes. And if you are cooking from it, it's a delight for all the smells and the tastes. But also it's a delight for the mind, because it's not just a cooking book. This book is an incredible hybrid of quite a few things. This book has a lot of history in it. It has a lot of personal memoir and history in it. And it also has a lot of politics and culture, as well as having food culture. So I wanted to, also, one of the things that, depending on where you are, I know Australia is such a multicultural country, and depending on where your history is from and where you're from, you'll probably recognise a lot of the dishes and flavours. They might seem familiar. I certainly know that, you know, coming from a family that cooked, you know, Egyptian and Syrian meals a lot, I recognise some of these dishes from my own childhood, and I can almost smell them by reading the ingredients and how to cook them. And yeah, I think that people who read this book will feel a sense of familiarity when they open this book. And I wanted to just start by getting a sense of your own family's journey to Australia, because you weren't born here. Your sister was, your youngest sister was, is that true?
Yes.
But you
So
weren't born here.
yeah, so there's 5 of us girls, all girls, which is really lovely. And the 4 of us, we were all born in Afghanistan. And by the time my family migrated to Australia, you know, we were all just small children under the age of about 8 or 9. And then my only sister who was born here in Australia is my younger sister, Rahana, who's now 25. But yeah, to kind of get a sense of why I included the history and the stories, and not just the recipes, for example. It was so important for me when I picked up the pen to kind of start the journey of writing this book, to invite people into a story about Afghanistan that was much broader and much deeper than what most of us have access to today. You know, I, being Afghan born and with an ancestry and a history connected to Afghanistan, kind of instinctively and naturally knew that there was so much more about Afghanistan than kind of what the narratives about it have been trapped in for the last 30, 40 years, and certainly the last 20 years of a world in a post-September 11 world and a war on terror. You know, so everything about Afghanistan has kind of, I thought its stories have been shrunk down and confined to these narratives that are just about kind of irreconcilability, the foreignness of the people, just how distant they are, how different we must be. And I thought, you know, if I'm going to write a story about the cuisine of Afghanistan, then I want that to be a story that can invite people in to see themselves in it, to see the universal aspects of what it means to be human, no matter where you're from. And as it so happens, Afghanistan has this really glorious, immense history of interculturalism and interconnection. And that's because of where it sits geographically at the center of the ancient Silk Roads. There were either people kind of trading through from all parts of the world, so from China in the northeast, or from India down below, or from the west, like Iran, Turkey, the Middle East, the Mediterranean. You know, these were the ancient crossroads, the networks that the world used to connect to one another. And it wasn't just goods that were traded and exchanged, it was ideas, religions, philosophies, you know. And I thought that was really the main story of Afghanistan, and actually the trajectory of human civilization, how it's unfolded. And I think this story of exchange and our connected histories is a neglected element of who we are today. You know, so much of how we perceive ourselves today, I think, is trapped in domination and this kind of distance between people that on surface level might appear really different. And so for me, it was just this really great opportunity to just unmask and strip past all those external superficial layers and tell a story that is so much deeper, and that is kind of symbolically embedded in the cuisine of Afghanistan, because of, as you mentioned, this familiarity that, you know, you picked up on with your own kind of Egyptian, Assyrian background. Well, yeah, it's because that's the story of how we've unfolded as humans. We've depended on each other, and it comes through in our food. And I really wanted to unpick that and explore it. And I kind of had this amazing experience of deep diving into my own history and my own ancestry and unearthing all these amazing things that to me speaks of and alludes to so many things that are far more prescient for us to remember and to know about each other today. So yeah, and then I guess just to answer your question, which was about my family's journey from Afghanistan into Australia, we migrated at the height of the Cold War in the mid-80s, and the Cold War, just to provide a bit of context, was this kind of geopolitical tensions playing out between Soviet Russia and its ideology of communism and the United States and this kind of idea of liberal democracy. And for a lot of countries all through South America and even the Eastern Bloc of Europe, you know, this was kind of, and Afghanistan, this was playing out on our soil. And for Afghanistan, the consequences were quite devastating. So this is where this is also, so communism kind of takes over the aura of Afghanistan, which is quite foreign to what is the traditional kind of millennia long ways of the people, which is about tribal kinship and faith and this kind of spirituality. And all of a sudden there's this idea that says that that it kind of puts atheism first, and so these things were just far too different, far too much for Afghanistan to switch to so suddenly. And this is around the time that Islamic fundamentalism kind of rears its head as well. So all these things are going on in Afghanistan, and it becomes a really dangerous place. So my parents decide in 1985, which is the year I was born, that, you know, just too many people within the family and community are either disappearing or being murdered, or it's just an unsafe place to be. And this is the time when most Afghans leave the country. So if you look at kind of primary sources and writing at the time, it's the time when over half of the country's population that still remains goes into exile. So it's a mass kind of drain of culture and knowledge and education out of the country, and I think the country still hasn't recovered from that blow. So my family left in 85, and we kind of escaped basically on foot. So if you would imagine my parents with 4 young children crossing the border from Afghanistan into Pakistan at the Khyber Pass. And it was a time when you weren't actually allowed to leave the country. And so many people had to kind of get these manufactured doctor's papers to say, we're just crossing over to go to a wedding or to visit a family member. And that's what my parents did. And I write about it in the book, but what happens is my father is delayed by a day. And so the date that's on the papers kind of has already passed. And, you know, out of desperation, he just kind of changes the date to make it look like it's the next day. And he hands it over to the border official, and the border official looks at it, and he knows it's been tampered with. And he says to my dad, "You've missed the wedding." And my dad says, "No, you know, I haven't. It's tomorrow. What do you, you know, we're going to make it." But the border official knows, and just kind of in a fateful moment, he says to my dad, "I know there's no wedding, and I know you're not coming back, but don't, you know, like take your family and go, you know, God help you, don't come back." And so for 2 years where we spend in a refugee camp in Pakistan, and that's also not, it's kind of that immediate port of safety because we're out of Afghanistan, but, you know, there's so much kind of so many dangerous things unfolding within the refugee camps too. And one of them is this kind of emergence of a real Islamic fundamentalism that was very new to Afghanistan. This is when it all starts to emerge. And so again, it's time to leave because my dad's life is at risk. And just by another stroke of fortune, my father runs into an old family friend who is leaving to come to Australia, and he takes down all of our details, and we get sponsored over, and we're accepted on humanitarian grounds in 87. So that's how my family made it to Australia.
And how old were you when you arrived here?
I was 2.
You probably don't have very clear memories of that moment.
No, not really, but my earliest memories are of living in St Kilda in a little unit, like a little flat, and it was not as gentrified as it is now, I can tell you that.
I've read the stories.
Yeah, exactly.
It's true. But so when you were researching this, then you couldn't really rely on your own memories of that that trip. So how was the process of I suppose you talked to your family members about what they required?
Yeah, absolutely. So piecing it all together was this really kind of, now I look at it as this gift, because if it wasn't for this book and the kind of granular detail I wanted to be able to write the story of it, I maybe wouldn't have had those kind of in-depth conversations with my parents. I spoke to them for hours. And then later on, I was thinking about it and I thought, they really are the last generation of Afghan people who have lived memories of being there at a time when it was in its era of peaceful stability, and where they actually imagined their futures playing out there with great hope, and I thought, this is something that needs to be passed down to my generation and to be recorded and shared, right? Because there are so many stories of people who live within conflict zones or areas that have long been afflicted by conflict. Those stories are kind of just erased from the kind of annals of history. And I thought, I was so grateful for that opportunity to speak in detail, blow by blow, with my parents about how this journey happened. And yeah, I relied on my mum and my dad. And interestingly, Chrissy, for them as well, it was the first time they relived it so vividly. And so it was just this really emotional transference of knowledge and energy and kind of a story that I'm so grateful to know in such detail.
Amazing. And there's also, I was really fascinated by the personal journey of your family particularly, but there's so much in the earlier sections of this book about the history of Afghanistan way before your family. You go right back in time to shifting borders and changing kind of allegiances and changing religions.
Yeah.
How was it researching all that stuff? It's quite a complicated history. It must have been tricky.
Yes. I spent a lot of time kind of reading and immersing myself in different types of kind of sources. And something that was really important for me was, as much as I could, I wanted sources that weren't just kind of Western imperial sources about the stories of people from Afghanistan. And the reason I wanted to kind of do that is because, you get a totally different picture of that history depending on, whose perspective it's written from. And I kind of wanted to be able to piece things together in a much more holistic, complex way. And as far as I could, I wanted to make Afghanistan at the center of this story, because, it just doesn't happen. You get these nations and these places that very much in our imagination today are considered very peripheral, and like they've played no role in the trajectory of the human story. And, Afghanistan in our present imagination is very much that kind of a place. So I thought, I want to know and I want to share a history that brings to life again this idea that, it wasn't always Western dominance that kind of shaped how our stories have unfolded. And, if you start to kind of read different sources, you get this fuller picture of this history of civilization that depended on ideas being transferred and exchanged. And that very much was unfolding along the Silk Roads. There was so much going from east into the west, and it doesn't make it any better, but it does kind of draw out this really important neglected fact that, our histories aren't about, the way we see the world today is very much this kind of concept of Western modernity that excludes everybody else. But when you look at these kind of histories of the Silk Roads and that kind of Central Asia, you know, these were the places that were the beacons of kind of architectural splendor, of scientific knowledge and advancement and that kind of thing. And I just thought, you know, this is a story that we don't know, but we should all know. And if we did all know it, it would just make us so much more appreciative of people, no matter where they're from, because we've all kind of played this role in shaping our ancestors, in shaping the world of today. So yeah, it was really important to go that far back in the history, because otherwise you would end up with this very sanitized version, sanitized and censored version of who we are, if I kind of stuck to the last few decades only.
I mean, is a lot of that history available? Do you speak your first language? Do you and do you read in Farsi, or what's your?
I mean, I still speak my first language quite fluently. So we were, or one of the, I write about it in the book as well, the two primary connections that we had to our ancestry growing up were language and food. And so I'm really grateful to have that connection to language. Then in terms of the other kind of things I was reading, it was, you know, just books by authors that weren't necessarily Western, or books by people who had lived in Afghanistan and traveled through and lived amongst people and kind of had this really nuanced understanding of Afghanistan. And also I kind of was speaking a lot to my mum and dad again about like our own writers. And it just so happened, I was so lucky and so privileged that some of those writers were people from my own family. So my grandmother's poetry, you know, for me, that's like a snapshot of Afghanistan before our histories were written for us through an imperial lens. My mother's first cousin, who I call my uncle, who kind of became this, he's passed away, but he kind of became this person that was always in the room with me as I was writing. You know, I feel like I had this immersive experience of connecting with these people and these stories that are forgotten. That made my hair stand because of how much I could see myself in those stories. So I had access to this kind of writing, and I kind of was able to piece together a picture that felt really live and really real to me.
You've woven a lot of that poetry through the book, which I loved, like coming across these little gems of poetry. And I wrote one down. There's your grandmother, Hamida, a poem, a snapshot from her poem is, "The eyes of the spring cloud become wet, weeping for the state of nature it finds you in." So beautiful. I kind of read that over and over again, thinking, wow, that's so beautiful.
It is beautiful, but it's also tragic at the same time, because what she foresaw, so my grandma died in quite young, and before kind of Afghanistan kind of gets hijacked by this Soviet US kind of war and essentially loses its way. But what she was kind of foreseeing was these early kind of emergence of this tribalism that was very stubborn. So, and which was not forgiving and didn't give any room and space for kind of growth. And you know, there was in the kind of 50s, 60s and 70s, it was actually a time of cultural flourishing and change for Afghanistan. So this was kind of the era of my grandparents. And the 30s and 40s was when they grew up. So my grandma passed in the 1960. But what she lived through was this time when there were kind of these forces in a push and pull, there was an intellectual renaissance, there was a spiritual flourishing. A lot of people were really well educated and had kind of this multiplicity of worldviews, and they were bringing those views into Afghanistan. And the 1964 Constitution of Afghanistan that my great uncle helped to draft was a constitution that sought to reconcile modernity with Islamic principles, and they didn't see that the two had to clash, and they had really good reason for that, you know. And they were kind of influenced a lot by people from Turkey and Egypt, you know, and they were kind of going through their own spiritual flourishings, trying to kind of connect Islam with modernity and democratic kind of ties with different countries all around, right? So these are the times that my grandparents and my parents were kind of living through. And so they knew that there was kind of another way forward, but there were always these very stubborn tribal factions that lived in the provinces of Afghanistan. And they rejected all sorts of kind of revolutions and concepts of what they saw as a very alien modernity. And that played a role in kind of undoing Afghanistan in so many ways, right? It wasn't all this foreign influence that was imposed on it. And that was one of the most kind of nuanced, helpful things I understood so much more about my country when I was reading and kind of researching all of this. And my grandma in her poem kind of was capturing that.
Yeah.
You know, she knew it was kind of this, she was like a feminist, and in some of her other poetry, she wrote about Afghan women kind of unveiling and how their veil is no protection, even though it's kind of, people are made to feel like it is their protection, you know. And I was kind of unearthing all of this poetry, and I was like, wow, this woman in like the 40s and 50s Afghanistan is writing this stuff. And I fell in love with her.
Yeah. Many strong women in your personal history as well, like reading back through the women in your family. I know you've got a large brood of women in your
we do.
but it comes from a huge amount of feminists, I would call all of them, really. And the idea of food as being something that women can bring to a table as well, you know, it's interesting when you read these histories that you must have read to put this book together. A lot of it is about the wars, the fighting, the men, the military, the people in government who are often men, but to have all of this folded like dough into a history of food culture, that seems to be a feminist act in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I think I was born a feminist, and I think it's in my blood. And I just really didn't understand a lot of that until I started to read about these women like my grandmother, and kind of hear stories about my great grandmother who, you know, her husband, my great grandfather, died, and she had these young children. And for most women, that would have meant like, that's it, it's all over, especially in kind of those earlier kind of times in the early 1900s, you know, like what would they have done? But, you know, these were women that in the face of those things, in the face of kind of that stigma attached to these kind of traditional notions of the role of a woman, stepped outside of that. And I think that is passed down into their children and eventually made its way to me and my nieces and nephews, because, you know, that is kind of a different way of being. It's a rejection of everything society tells you you need to be. And for women like my grandparents and my great grandparents, in their time, that rejection has life and death consequences. It's not just a matter of like social isolation, for example. You know, the consequences can be quite dramatic. And so these were my icons, you know, seeing these women. And this is the other thing that I love about unearthing this. This is a totally non-Western feminist perspective. And it is a feminist perspective that is so ingrained and so natural and almost inseparable from the core of who they are as humans. And to me, that's a feminism that resounds, and one that I hope I can carry on too.
It's wonderful. So it was your grandmother, wasn't it, who brought a chef into the family when her husband died and she was so, you know, swamped with all these young children.
Yeah.
She brought a chef in to cook and to teach the children.
That's right. Yeah. So that was my great grandma, and when her husband passed away, she kind of realized that it was all up to her, you know, to raise these children, so my grandma and her siblings, in a way that made sure that they weren't left behind. Or, you know, oftentimes in those societies, when the father passes away, the children are seen as orphans, even if the mum's still alive, right? And so for her, it was really important that her children were still raised with their head held high and, you know, kind of knowing who they were. And part of that was cooking, and part of it was also language and poetry and philosophy. So she made sure they were really well educated and could contribute. And, you know, they went on to contribute in amazing ways. My great uncle, you know, he was one of 4 people that drafted the nation's constitution. And their children again were people who were literary greats and whose work is still kind of in print in France, in Afghanistan, you know, this kind of thing. So the decisions she made then carried on and had really important resonances and implications. And yeah, so she brought in this a chef, and that wasn't really an uncommon thing if a family could afford it, but she wanted the chef to pass that knowledge on to the children if they were interested. And my grandma Bibi Hamida was, and then I feel like that's the connection that was then passed down onto my mother as well, who loved to cook, and it was just this natural kind of inclination in her.
Fantastic. The end point of this, I suppose, is that when your family, so we've talked about the history and the coming here, when your family arrived here, one of the things that they brought with them was this kind of vast knowledge of Afghan cooking. And that was what kind of took them forward into the next stage of their lives. Can you talk a little bit about, well, firstly, what does Parwana mean, and the opening of the restaurant?
Yeah, absolutely. So Parwana means butterfly. In terms of the word means butterfly in Farsi. And when we were kind of making decisions, I'll go a little bit into how it all came about, but when we were making decisions around the name, Parwana was a name that was nostalgic for my parents, because it was the name of a restaurant that they used to go to and that everyone loved. Excuse me. And then we also thought the way the word sounds is just beautiful, and anyone can say it. So it's not one of those kind of harder Farsi or Arabic kind of words with kind of sounds that most people can't pronounce. Like, it's just this really easy word to say. And then I talk about it a little in the book as well, but in hindsight, I think it was just the most beautiful name because of the transformation that food enabled my family to have, like our own kind of personal metamorphosis, our own journey with food and with our restaurants, and now with the book. You know, a lot of that is just embedded into the name and the meaning of the name now, I think. But yeah, so my family came over to Australia, and like so many kind of migrant families, refugee families, you know, the skill set that adults come over with is kind of null. It's all just nullified. So my parents were both educated people, but when they came to Australia, they had to start again. And so we started with nothing, essentially. My parents put themselves into English school. They had a grasp of the language. They both spoke it in Afghanistan, but I guess for it to be a different type of English and a firmer grasp of it. And my sisters and I were all kind of enrolled into school, and we just kind of started our lives again from nothing. And I mentioned it earlier, but like the two kind of main ways that for us as children who really don't have those kind of memories and that attachment to Afghanistan, as say my parents do, because of they grew up there and they have these like adult experiences of being there. For us, the only way we kind of, the illusions to who we were beyond kind of our identity unfolding in Australia was through language and through food. So food kind of started to fill this really central part in our lives. And I look back on it, and as I was reflecting for the book, I was like, why was food this really important thing? It's not like my mum was a trained chef, for example, or that we kind of left restaurants in Afghanistan and then decided to do the same thing here. You know, here food became this really important, massive part of our lives. And it always has been traditionally and culturally for Afghans. At the centerpiece of every gathering is a huge feast or what, you know, the best you can kind of put forward to your guests. And hospitality is a massive part of our cuisine. And I kind of go into the reasons of kind of being at the center of the Silk Road. You never know who's kind of passing through. And there's this tradition of inviting people in, not asking them who they are or where they're from, but just feeding them and making sure they're okay. You know, so I feel like all that stuff just kind of trickles down into the essence of who you are. And so food stayed as this really important thing for us. And it also became a way for us to bond with each other. You know, if we come into the more contemporary story of what it is to be a displaced person coming from the East into the West, you know, there's an intergenerational gap that everybody has with their parents and grandparents, but we also had to negotiate this intercultural gap, because our experience as children growing up in Australia, the bulk of our lives, was very different to my parents' perception of the world. And so we had to negotiate in a way that was much more nuanced and complex than for, say, people who have, you know, generations have grown up here. And food was a way to navigate that, you know, and when we opened up Parwana, it kind of came into being because everybody loved my mum's food, and she was kind of doing this community kind of catering or weddings or just kind of any celebrations. People would ask my mum to kind of make the food because she was just so great at it. And then slowly from that, you know, people outside of the Afghan community also started to ask her to kind of cater for different events. And then we thought, why don't we just open up like a little storefront, bricks and mortar, and if nothing else, we'll have a kitchen for the catering. And literally from that, it kind of just grew, and we're still in the same spot we are, but like also in the building next door, which is really lovely. But I also think that in a more kind of, if you think about it more in a spiritual or emotional sense as to why we stayed so connected to food, you know, my mum had this intuition that Afghan culture now for decades has just been scattered and exiled, and there's so much trauma associated for Afghan people as their lives unfold, even on new lands. You know, there's a lot of kind of healing that you have to do after you've been totally uprooted and have to start again, and also because of kind of these ongoing acts of violence. And so food became this act of healing and preservation, and eventually a way to share, you know, a way to share this kind of nuanced, bigger, interconnected cultural story that anyone can relate to. That's what food started to mean to us. And so that's what it was for us. It was this conduit, it was this navigation, this way for us to connect our worlds and to have something to offer.
And from the restaurant comes this book as well, which is, you know, your extra contribution, I suppose, to that culture as well. And I'd like people to get a little sense of the book. I wonder whether you would have been able to write it without going back to Afghanistan and seeing the place. It feels like almost you needed to do that journey to come full circle and to create something as beautiful as this.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. You know, so the first time I went back after my family, we got to Australia in 1987. In 2012 was the first time we went back, and I was 27. And I didn't know it at the time that I was going to write this book. You know, it wasn't even in the picture, but I'm an avid journaler. So I was so grateful to kind of pick up those journals and just flick through what I was seeing and that kind of thing. But even with the journal aside, there was so much of it that was kind of seared into my memory because of the effect it had on me going back to Afghanistan, and how it completed it, kind of, yes, a full circle. All these things about me that I didn't really understand, I started to understand because I was back in Afghanistan, and I had that opportunity to kind of be back on the land of my ancestry and of my birth. And it kind of prompted me to become more interested in that story and to become more involved in like my family's food kind of businesses and our restaurants and that kind of thing, and to grow that. And to, yes, definitely a massive part of the kind of energy, the memories that fed into writing this book was because I had that experience of being on the land.
Can you give us a bit of a taste of that by reading a little section about that from the book?
Sure, I'd love to. It's on page 206, and it's in kind of one of the last chapters of the book. And it's basically kind of starting to full circle this book of what culture, how culture is kind of fueled by this process of creativity and our own shifted experiences. And by this point, you know, we're migrants in Australia. I've grown up here, but I still feel very connected to my ancestry and my culture, you know, and what that process of evolution and change is like. And I guess this is one of the things I saw that helped fuel that process for me. And the subheading is Reversing the Paths Travelled, Voyagers Return to Afghanistan. It was against such a global backdrop that in April 2012, my sisters, nieces, brother-in-law and I returned to Afghanistan. We crossed the border on foot from Pakistan into Afghanistan at the Khyber Pass. We were retracing our footsteps in the opposite direction to that taken 27 years earlier, when as children, our parents had bundled us together and under a cloud of uncertainty and blind hope, negotiated our way out of Afghanistan and into our future. We were returning as adults, pulled forward by an allure we were yet to understand, perhaps simply by a need to know more. The most striking thing about Afghanistan was its epic landscape, lush and fertile on our arrival in spring. The giant silhouettes of the snow-capped mountains of the Hindu Kush and the cascading layers of crumpled and velvety peaks that lay staggered beneath them inspired an overwhelming reverence, extracting an almost involuntary relinquishment of ego. The peaks played with light and shadow throughout the day, creating a natural rolling spectacle from daybreak to dark, always with an ethereal luminosity. At the base of the peaks, vast valleys of bright green grass and crops stretched out like gently rolling oceans. It was a landscape with its own distinct energy that easily contextualized the vulnerability of being human and which had watched history unfurl. One of the most immediate and unexpected aspects of Afghanistan that lingers as an enduring memory was the invitation it extended to us. It wrapped us in a warm embrace, as if it had been permanently imprinted with the memory of seeing us come into the world. Many things seemed strangely familiar, from the worn but still kind features of its people, to the social mannerisms, to the sweet smell of the spring air.
Amazing. I think people can tell from that reading that this is the kind of book that not only can you just have it in the kitchen and cook from it, you know, on a daily basis, but that you can actually take it to the bedroom and you know, pour over it before you go to sleep with stories that will take you to places that maybe you haven't gone before. So I really think that this is quite an amazing book. And it's even structured, like I think that there's something really wonderful about the way this book is structured, because you have, after every, I suppose, they're almost like little mini essays in the book. So every mini essay with its own little kind of thoughts and ideas, it kind of then throws you to a bunch of recipes that are related to a theme. Can you talk a little bit about why you did that and what you did there?
Sure. I think it ties into what we were talking about a bit earlier, about how I needed this book, and I kind of had this subconscious idea that I was being tasked with something quite immense and I wanted to get it right. You know, this isn't the only perspective of Afghanistan. You know, we're not homogenous. Everyone has their own story, you know, but this is my story, and and my family's story, and I wanted that to be as kind of nuanced and complex and real as I could make it. And so a really big kind of thing that I was being driven by, an intuition I was being driven by, was I wanted people to kind of be immersed in the recipes and the cooking and the beauty of the kind of cross connection and the cross pollination that underpins Afghan recipes and its cuisine. But I also wanted them to understand why the food is the way it is. And I thought that, you know, instead of kind of doing a sweets or a seasonal kind of breakup, or, you know, of the food, I wanted the recipes to tie into the story. So I wanted the recipes to be chronological or kind of event driven as far as possible. So just for example, at the beginning, I start with the recipes that most reflect this interconnection of recipes and ingredients, or, you know, dishes like the dumplings that are directly like this manifestation of this traveling, this human history of traveling across the Silk Roads. And then I kind of come into the more contemporary history of Afghanistan, where nationhood starts to emerge, and, you know, I kind of do the dishes that are a bit more driven by this sense of a defined sense of nationhood. And then by the time we get to the Parwana recipe, I wanted to include the recipes of from Parwana that have become like these signature iconic dishes that people love, you know. And then, yeah, and so I just thought that for me, that was a much more kind of intuitive, natural way for the recipes to unfold. And I wanted the whole thing to just be one big story, basically.
Yeah. I love how you put it in the book too. So you've got this, you know, just before the section, just after the historical kind of background of this, you say the recipes in this chapter have been chosen for their reflection of the shared ancient history that has given rise to Afghan culture and the congenial spirit that underlies the culture of food in the region. It's just it just makes you feel like you're a part of this history, and that then you turn to those. You turn to those recipes, and I'll hold this first page of that section up, you know, which is incredibly beautiful, that image there, and the colours and the image and the spices and the mix of cultures. And you read through these recipes in that section which reflect the history, and suddenly it takes on this new life, you know, this life that makes you think of that deep time, which is wonderful. And my favorite, I suppose, throw is to, I'll just see if I've marked it correctly, is to the preserves. So let me find that section. So just after a bit of your kind of family history, and you've gone back to Afghanistan, there's a section which says, the recipes in this chapter illustrate the further bridging of the many influences in our lives, particularly driven by the experience of returning to Afghanistan for the first time since leaving as small children, the street food influence, a time-honoured part of Afghan cuisine, and whose concepts we thought important to share through Kuchi Deli Parwana. It's captured in this chapter's recipes alongside the pickles and preserves so lovingly prepared by my family we encountered on our travels. These recipes bring us back full circle in the cycle of creativity that fuels culture to respond to the challenges of the day while sourcing its legitimacy and value by staying rooted in its own past, if only to contribute in meaningful ways to our increasingly shared futures. And I had never really, I'd kind of known that, you know, preserves and pickles, you know, you think about them in terms of a day-to-day needing to kind of survive the winter months or months when those foods don't happen. You think about it in terms of that kind of short-term history. But what you've done in this book is really to make you, as you're reading those recipes and as you're doing that pickling, it starts to make you think about history and how pickles then survive generations, and how there's a continuity in those processes. I really take my hat off to you. You've really captured something incredibly special in this book.
Oh, thank you, Chrissy.
Beautiful.
That's just so lovely to hear, that the kind of intent and sort of what started to, I really didn't have many preconceptions when I started this. I just knew I wanted to dive deep and unearth and come back with whatever it was I found. And I just kept coming back to, you know, we manifest as these people in this moment in time, but we cannot be without everything that has come before. And in this moment, we're contributing to everything that will unfold. And I kind of kept seeing myself in that way as I was writing and kind of trying to uncover this story. And yeah, I wanted to, and so this is the last chapter with the recipes, and then it kind of wraps up, the book wraps up. And when I was thinking about how I wanted to, what to include at the end, yes, it was the kind of, so Kuchi Deli Parwana is our little kind of lunchtime spot, and it's a bit more fast paced, and it reflects kind of what we saw when we were in Afghanistan, the colors, the lights, the kind of the food culture, the street food culture that we saw when we were there. But also this full circle. And the last chapter, the last recipe in the book is of fig jam, and it's my grandfather's fig jam recipe. And my mum told me years later that they would all chase each other for the pot and the spoon just to lick the remnants that were in the pot. And that's exactly what my sisters and I would do when my mum would make her fig jam. And I just thought, we're kind of imprinted by our ancestry in ways that sometimes we don't even know, and sometimes we'll figure it out because of a story you hear or something you unearth, and that is very much the essence, the driver of how we unfold, I think. And so for me, it was really important to bring it back full circle and leave it open to wherever those circles might go.
It's beautiful. It really is a beautiful, beautiful thing you've created here.
Thank you so much.
Now, Jen, I know you had a question that you wanted to ask. Were there any questions from the audience?
I don't have any questions through at the moment. If anyone would like to type them in the chat, you're very welcome to. Mine's the typical kind of 8-year-old child's question, I have to admit. I was wondering if you have a favorite recipe in here.
That's a great question. I love that question. Yes, I do. One of the difficult things about choosing a favorite recipe with Afghan cuisine is, as you'll see if you kind of go through the book, Afghan food is never really a dish alone. It's so many things put together, right? So if you're invited to an Afghan person's house, or if you're at an Afghan celebration, for example, or if you come to the restaurant, you would have rice as a centerpiece, and then various curries or meats, kebabs around it, with naans and chutneys and pickles, all on the side. And all these things together on your plate, a little bit of everything, makes an Afghan meal. But with that disclaimer, I do have a favorite, and it's the bolani, which is the stuffed flatbreads. I'll hold it up.
Oh, yum.
And the reason they're a favorite is because, well, who doesn't love a stuffed flatbread hot off the skillet? And you can also get quite creative with them because, you can fill them with whatever seasonal filling or whatever you fancy, really. So when we make them, we'll do like a lamb mince filling or like a leek filling or a pumpkin filling, and Afghans always cook the fillings, it's not just this chopped up stuff. It's always, the fillings have so much flavor. And then you hand roll the dough, and the way we would do it traditionally is everyone gets together to kind of make the bolani. So there's a lot of like fun and kind of communality in the preparation. And then, you kind of sear them on a heavy based kind of skillet, and then you'll have your chutneys and your yogurts and traditionally some sweet tea. We always have it with a little bit of sweet tea, and you just kind of eat them as they're being made, and it's just delicious. And so much of Afghan food and cuisine and the traditions that surround it is about this sense of congeniality and being together and communality, and I think that's one of the most important things, not just about Afghan food, but that kind of has been imprinted into who I am as a person, and it kind of traces back to these traditions of how we make our food.
That's wonderful. I'm going to mention that I'm one of these people, very unusual people, who normally skips the dessert sections of a book. Yeah. I'm not really all that interested in desserts in general. Yeah. But I've always said I really like Asian desserts. I'm such a fan of Asian desserts. I really hate Western desserts, but I like Asian desserts. And when I came to the desserts in your book, I just want to hold them up to show people so that they're desperate to get this book. Look at that. What is not to love about that particular, it's a drink, but it's a dessert as well, isn't it? And it has basil seeds that have been soaked, which is something that I didn't know about. Like actually soaking the basil seeds makes them into these like almost tapioca.
Yeah, pretty much. So that's a really beautiful recipe. So it's like it's called faluda, and it's basically like a drink / edible dessert, because there's jelly pieces in it called marut, and like you make the jelly, and then there's the basil seeds and a rose syrup and ice cream and nuts and that kind of thing. And traditionally people have it in summer, the ice cream, yes, but also the basil seeds have like core cooling properties. So that's why in a lot of like Asian cuisine, you have like basil seed infused drinks and that kind of thing that people have in summer. And my mum was telling me these stories of how when they were kids, they would go to like the ancient quarters of Kabul, so like the old markets after school with their dad, and they would go specifically to this one shop to get this faluda, and then they would all have their own little cups of faluda like as kids, and they just sit in a park and eat it all together. So it's very much a part, and it's a dessert that you can find all through kind of Southeast Asia, the subcontinent. Everyone does their own variation of it. And Jill Duplay, who writes for The Australian, has wrote a whole piece on the faluda, and when we were talking about it, she said it's kind of like the grandfather of these bubble tea drinks that we get now. And I said, yes, faluda is the grandfather of bubble tea.
It sure is.
Sounds like it should be a dessert, faluda.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds sweet.
Just flick to a couple more pictures that have really made my mouth water. This one with a yogurt drink, and not being able to deal with milk products in my digestive system, I thought that this would be an absolutely perfect way to deal with that. And also this little picture here, if you can see, with all of the kind of biscuits and the slices all put together on the plates, it just makes me think of, the high tea has nothing on cooking on it. Like really, this is the way to eat it, just put them all together.
I've actually got another question here as well.
Yeah.
Faiza was wondering if you would mind sharing a little bit more about your journey to publishing.
Sure. So the book came about really quite organically, in the sense that Chrissy alluded to it earlier. So we had the restaurants, and the restaurants for me were this act of like preservation of history and culture, and cuisine that is kind of at risk really of being quite scattered because of all of this kind of breakup that Afghanistan has endured, while also being this bridge contributing to the future and to the community that we now live in, and being able to share this deeper, nuanced story of who we are and maybe who we all are, right? And being able to see ourselves as interconnected. So the book kind of is, I feel, the written, physical manifestation of that same essence of what the restaurants are and what food is to my family. And with that in mind, we always kind of had at the back of our head, well, not always, after a few years of kind of having the restaurant and seeing how people wanted to engage in a deeper story about Afghanistan and wanted to know more, and kind of were like, oh, wow, I never knew the food from a place that for them might have been associated as so war-torn or as desolate and arid. They were like, we would always have these comments of, I never knew or never imagined that your food was so beautiful, or this is so familiar to me. So really kind of there's this story there waiting to be told. And so after a few years of seeing that people didn't really have a very full picture, it kind of came into, my family and I, we were like, we should one day do this cookbook, and then next step of preserving kind of this history and being able to share it even more widely. And then we were approached by Corinne, who is my publisher from Murdoch Books. She had come to Adelaide and had dined at the restaurant. And there were a couple of others who had asked us if we would do a recipe book, but for whatever reason, the timing wasn't right, that kind of thing. Or, I was always going to be me, I guess, in my family who wrote it, because I kind of have always been writing different pieces, and this, like, I knew I would love to do that eventually one day, like with my mom and my family, kind of collate all these recipes. But when Corinne approached us, which was 2018, everything felt right. I kind of was, so I guess it was a manifestation of how it came to be, was for me as the writer of this book, I felt like I was in the right space and I'd had enough of an experience to be able to put this together and maybe do the story some justice. And also, when speaking to the publisher, it all just felt right. I had this great instant connection with the publisher, and I feel like that's a really important thing, because the publisher, Corinne specifically, and her team, you know, they just had so much trust in, you know, I'd never, this is my first book. They didn't know us other than having come to have dined at Parwana and loving kind of the feel and the meal and a few kind of initial chats. But yeah, after kind of putting together a pitch that was probably not quite very ordinary in terms of how I wanted to write the book and attach the recipes to stories and make it chronological and genealogical and all this stuff, and seeing that the publisher had that trust to let this story unfold, I felt like that was a great connection, and it all just unfolded very organically from there. So I hope that answers your question in terms of how the publishing kind of contract actually came to be, if that's what the questioner was asking.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
That's great. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We're coming to the end of our time now, but for people who want to go back and listen to other parts of it, we do have a YouTube channel, which will be a chance for other people to come and meet you and to enjoy the stories about this book, which is absolutely gorgeous. And I really think that it would be the perfect Christmas gift for anybody who wants to, you know, put something beautiful under, you know, particularly like a parent, a mother or a child. You know, it's a wonderful gift for a member of your family to honor your kind of the lineage and the passing on of stories, whether, you know, whether you're from Inala or whether you're from, you know, Western Sydney or whether you're from Eastern Europe, it doesn't matter. This is a story that will touch anyone who has a history to tell. So Parwana is a triumph. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Oh, thank you so much, Chrissy, and thank you, Jen and avid readers, for having me. It's just such a joy that the book is resonating, and it's always such a privilege to be able to share our story. So thank you.
Thank you, Durkhanai. Thank you, Chrissy. This has been just such a warm and generous conversation, and I've really cherished the discussion of identity in it. I'm just asking everyone to unmute, and if you're able to, and in your current scenario, if you would just join me in a round of applause or a thank you from where you are, that would be lovely. But yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Great.
Thanks.
Thank
See you
you.
later.
Good night, everyone.